Romance in the Middle Ages is often imagined through songs of knights and ladies, through painted manuscripts of devotion and loyalty, through stories of castles and feasts. Yet beneath the poetry lay a reality far less graceful. Bodies rarely bathed, teeth decayed quickly, and lice crawled through hair and beds. Perfumes were scarce, garments unwashed, and the smell of labor never left skin. Marriage brought not comfort but duty, and intimacy unfolded within the presence of fleas, damp straw, and smoke from open hearths. Even among nobles, perfume could not fully mask the odor of disease or the staleness of wool worn for months. What was praised as courtly love rested on foundations of discomfort, hunger, and illness. Tonight we move slowly through that world, with its small joys hidden inside its filth. Close your eyes, settle into stillness, and join us in the forgotten truth of medieval romance. Baths rarely taken. Romance in medieval Europe unfolded in a world where cleanliness was scarce. Baths were rare, water often avoided, and bodies carried the marks of sweat, dirt, and disease. For men and women alike, attraction grew not from perfume or polished appearance, but from endurance of conditions that modern eyes find difficult to imagine. Bathing was limited. In many villages, there were no public bathhouses. Rivers and ponds served when the weather allowed, but most relied on a basin of water in homes, used sparingly. The church discouraged bathing, fearing it stirred vanity or lust. Some sermons warned against frequent washing, declaring it indulgence. As a result, months could pass between proper baths. The body carried smells of labor. Fields, stables, and kitchens filled skin and clothing with odors of smoke, sweat, and animals. Woolen garments absorbed these scents deeply, rarely washed, often worn until threadbare. Lovers met in halls or fields, surrounded by smells of dung and unwashed bodies. Their sense of romance shaped within that reality. Perfumes were scarce, reserved for the wealthy. Oils of rose, lavender, or musk came from distant lands, traded at high price. Nobles might rub these into their hair or garments, masking the odor of sweat. For commoners, herbs were used instead: sprigs of mint tucked into clothing, rosemary burned in homes, sage boiled into simple washes. These scents did little to cover the weight of dirt. Teeth carried their own decay. Bread ground with grit wore enamel away, leaving mouths filled with pain. Cavities, abscesses, and foul breath were common. Lovers spoke close with words of affection while carrying the smell of rot. No brushes, no pastes, no rinses softened the reality. At best, twigs were chewed to clean, or herbs chewed to mask odor. Hair was another challenge. Lice spread easily, their presence accepted as ordinary. Combs of bone or wood helped, but infestations returned quickly. Children and adults alike carried them. Women covered hair with veils, men with caps, yet beneath these coverings, lice thrived. In moments of intimacy, these small pests remained close. Beds offered no refuge. Straw mattresses, damp and musty, crawled with fleas and vermin. Blankets were rough wool, rarely cleaned. Two lovers lying together did so in the company of insects, the air filled with smoke from fires and the smell of unwashed bodies. Romance unfolded not in comfort, but in conditions of discomfort endured together. Disease lingered. Skin infections, boils, and rashes were common. The spread of plague, leprosy, and fever shaped communities. Affection risked exposure, yet life continued. Marriage joined bodies long before medicine could protect them. Love carried with it the shadow of illness, its risks accepted because choice was limited. Archaeological remains confirm these realities. Lice combs are found in graves, their teeth worn by constant use. Skeletons show teeth worn to stubs, jaws marked by abscesses. Chronicles describe plagues, fevers, and skin diseases spreading through households. The romance of poetry and song lived alongside the daily reality of filth. Courtly love, praised in poems, spoke of noble gestures, of knights serving ladies with devotion. Yet even in courts, where perfumes and fine fabrics softened life, bodies remained largely unwashed, teeth rotted, and lice persisted. Beneath the poetry lay the same conditions found in villages. Romance was not shaped by comfort. It was shaped by endurance, by acceptance of filth as ordinary. Lovers met in fields filled with animals, in halls filled with smoke, in homes where fleas stirred from straw. The ideals of devotion and loyalty were born in a world where bodies rarely knew the relief of water, where scent and sickness were constant companions. For those who lived it, The disgust we see was invisible. It was the norm, expected, and accepted. Attraction existed despite it, or perhaps because both partners shared the same reality. Romance unfolded not in beauty, but in survival within dirt, hunger, and disease, rotten teeth, and foul breath. Affection in the Middle Ages was not free from the realities of the body. When lips met in a kiss, they carried the weight of decay, of rot, of disease. Teeth, worn down by coarse bread ground with grit, crumbled and blackened in early years. Mouths carried constant pain, and breath was heavy with odors that no herb could fully mask. Bread formed the base of every diet. Grains were ground between rough stones, leaving behind fragments of sand that wore enamel away. By adolescence, teeth were already chipped and weakened. Cavities formed quickly, growing into abscesses. Jaws swelled, gums bled, and infection spread. Skeletons uncovered from medieval graves show worn molars, exposed nerves, and jaws marked by abscess scars. Romance unfolded in a world where mouths were filled not with smiles of health, but with evidence of decay. Tooth care was limited. Some chewed sticks, frayed at the ends, to scrape at plaque. Others rinsed with vinegar or rubbed herbs along their gums. Sage, mint, or parsley were chewed to sweeten breath, though only briefly. For most, these measures delayed but never prevented disease. No paste, no brush, no modern medicine softened the reality. Pain was endured, and foul breath became ordinary. Bad breath was not only from teeth. Diets heavy in onions, garlic, and strong ale added their own layers of odor. With little water consumed, mouths dried, carrying smells even more strongly. Lovers whispered in halls, their words filled with sense of food and decay alike. Intimacy meant breathing air thick with the smell of survival. Kissing, praised in poetry and song, carried risks beyond smell. Mouths spread disease colds, fevers, even plague when it entered blood through sores. Yet the act persisted, its discomfort ignored, its risks accepted. In troubadour verses, a kiss symbolized devotion, yet in daily life, it was another exchange of illness. Among nobles, efforts were greater. Perfumed waters, mixed with rose or cloves, were used to rinse mouths. Expensive powders made of ground spices were rubbed against teeth. These brought temporary freshness, but disease returned quickly. Archaeological remains of royal skeletons show the same decay as peasants, proof that wealth bought little protection from rot. The pain of teeth marked life. Abscesses swelled, breaking through skin. Infections spread into jaws, sometimes into the bloodstream, ending lives quietly. For many, this was not rare but common. Yet affection continued. Lovers endured pain and odor together, their romance shaped by what was normal. To them, bad breath was not unusual. It was part of the body, as constant as hunger. Poetry ignored these truths. Troubadours praised the sweetness of a kiss, the beauty of smiles, the joy of whispered words. Beneath those lines, however, reality remained. Teeth blackened, gums bled, mouths carried disease. Courtly love was written in verses, but lived in the staleness of breath. Archaeological finds confirm it clearly. Skulls reveal teeth, ground to stubs, molars hollowed by decay, jaws pitted with infection. No smile in the Middle Ages was free of pain. Lovers looked into eyes, touched hands. But when lips met, they met through the taste of rot. Romance in medieval times was not clean, not fresh, not sweet. It carried the bitter scent of illness, the sharp taste of herbs, the heaviness of decay. For children, this was learned early, as their teeth wore down before youth was done. For adults, it was endured, another hardship of life. In that world, attraction was not destroyed by these truths. It adapted. Devotion was built on acceptance, on survival in filth. The modern idea of a kiss as sweetness did not exist. A kiss in the Middle Ages was endurance, intimacy within rot, affection despite disease. It was love shaped by hunger, by hardship, and by teeth that seldom remained whole. Lice, fleas, and vermin. Romance in the Middle Ages was lived in close company with insects. Lice crawled through hair, fleas jumped from straw beds, and vermin moved quietly through clothing and homes. Affection unfolded not in clean chambers, but in spaces alive, with creatures feeding, biting, and spreading disease. For men and women alike, Intimacy meant accepting these companions as ordinary. Lice were constant. They thrived in unwashed hair, clinging to roots, feeding on blood. Children carried them, adults carried them, even nobles beneath veils, and crowns were not free. Combs made of bone or wood survived from the period, their teeth close together, worn from constant scraping. Yet no comb removed them entirely. Within days they returned, breeding again, moving from head to head. Lovers who pressed close, who touched or kissed, shared lice as easily as words. Fleas filled bedding. Straw mattresses, damp with sweat and smoke, were never free of them. Blankets of rough wool trapped the insects, providing warmth and shelter. At night, fleas swarmed, biting skin, leaving red marks along arms, legs, and necks. Two bodies lying together brought not rest, but more bites. Romance took place in beds where movement stirred insects as much as passion. Vermin spread through clothing. Woolen robes, rarely washed, carried fleas in folds. Linen undergarments, when present, soaked with sweat and attracted lice. Washing was costly in time and labor, so garments were worn until threadbare. Lovers met in garments alive with hidden insects, their closeness ensuring that pests moved easily between them. The wealthy faced the same. Perfumes, fine cloth, and veils masked odor, but lice crawled beneath them. Fleas hid in feather mattresses as readily as in straw. Rats moved through castles, as they did through huts, their presence marked by gnawed wood and droppings. Wealth softened food and clothing, but not the bite of vermin. Disease followed. Fleas carried plague. Lice spread fevers. Rats carried sickness into homes. Affection was shadowed by illness, yet life continued. Couples married, children were born, and intimacy remained. Survival required endurance, and insects were accepted as part of that endurance. Chroniclers mention vermin in passing, noting infestations in monasteries, castles, and villages alike. No place was free. Archaeological digs reveal combs filled with nits, straw layers crawling with insect remains. The bones of rats and fleas are found in layers of medieval homes. The evidence confirms what texts suggest. Romance and vermin coexisted without pause. Songs and poetry never spoke of this truth. Troubadours praised smooth hair, bright eyes, and soft touch. They did not sing of lice crawling through braids or fleas biting skin. Yet behind the verses, reality remained. Lovers sang of beauty while scratching at bites, kissed while carrying lice, and lay together while fleas stirred in straw. The smell of smoke, sweat, and herbs mixed with the itch of insects. Women combed their hair daily. Men shook out clothing, but both carried pests again within days. Families shared them, couples shared them, entire villages lived with them. Romance unfolded not in separation from this reality, but in acceptance of it. The discomfort shaped intimacy. Lovers scratched at bites together, picked lice from each other's hair, and shared the daily labor of enduring vermin. Insects became part of relationships, their presence constant and unremarked. Modern disgust was absent. The crawling, biting, itching was background, no more unusual than hunger or cold. For children born of these unions, lice and fleas were among the first experiences of touch. Infants wrapped in wool carried them, toddlers scratched at bites, and by youth, the pests were ordinary. Courtship, marriage, and family life continued within this environment, its filth invisible to those inside it. Archaeological finds confirm lice eggs still clinging to hair from medieval burials, fleas trapped in preserved bedding, and rat remains in castle floors. These fragments show that intimacy in the Middle Ages was never free from vermin. The disgusting truth is not exception but norm. Every kiss, every embrace, every shared bed carried lice and fleas as companions. Romance in medieval times was shaped not by roses or candles, but by endurance of pests. Lice crawled, fleas bit, vermin spread, yet affection survived. Love was not clean, but lived in filth, accepted as life itself. The smell of sweat. Romance in the Middle Ages was inseparable from the smell of the body. Without frequent bathing, without clean garments, without perfumes for most, sweat shaped attraction as much as sight. Lovers met in spaces where odor clung to stone, to wool, to skin. The truth of intimacy was not sweetness but heaviness, the constant scent of survival in a world without soap. Baths were rare. In some regions, bathhouses existed, but many closed after church warnings that bathing encouraged lust. Priests preached that washing too often tempted the flesh, and so abstinence from water was seen as virtue. Common people washed hands and faces, but full baths were taken only a few times a year, if at all. Rivers offered water in summer, yet in winter the cold made immersion dangerous. Most lived and loved unwashed. Sweat filled every garment. Robes of wool, heavy and coarse, absorbed it deeply. The fibers trapped odor until it became part of the cloth. A man working in fields returned with garments soaked, the smell of earth and sweat ground into fabric. A woman tending kitchens or washing clothing carried smoke and damp on her skin. Lovers embraced in clothes alive with scent, the odor of weeks or months of labor surrounding them. Summer made this sharper. Fields demanded endless work beneath the Sunday sweat, poured from brows, soaked hair, and streamed down backs. There were no perfumes for peasants, no powders to mask odor. Romance took place in fields where the scent of bodies mingled with animals, with soil, with dung. A kiss meant breathing that mixture, closeness carrying every layer of labor. Even among nobles, bathing was not common. Some castles had tubs of wood, water carried by servants, heated by fire. But heating water was costly, and tubs were used by many in turn. Lords and ladies sometimes bathed monthly, others less. They wore perfumes of rose, lavender, or musk, but these masked rather than removed odor. When garments of velvet or silk were worn for weeks, sweat still clung beneath. Breath added to the scent. Teeth rotted, gums bled, and the smell of decay mixed with sweat. Diets heavy with onions, garlic, and strong ale added their own layer. Lovers whispered in halls filled with smoke, their words carrying scents of food, drink, and rot. The sweetness described in poems was distant from the reality of mouths heavy with odor. Hair absorbed sweat as well. Without frequent washing, oils built up. Hair grew greasy, thick with dirt, carrying the smell of labor. Lice thrived in this, crawling through strands, feeding on blood, leaving sores on scalps. Combs scraped through daily, removing some pests. But the odor of unwashed hair remained. Women covered their heads with veils, men with caps, yet coverings only trapped scent further. Beds offered no escape. Straw mattresses absorbed sweat, damp with moisture, musty with mold. Blankets of wool carried odors of years. Lovers lay together in bedding alive with fleas, soaked with smells of smoke, sweat, and soil. There was no freshness, no linen sheets, no scented oils. The body met the body, as it was unwashed, unsoftened, marked by odor. Romance, praised in troubadour poetry, ignored these truths. Verses spoke of purity, of beauty, of sweetness. But chroniclers writing daily records noted otherwise. Letters complain of foul odors in courts, of nobles reeking of sweat beneath perfumes. Medical texts mention the staleness of bodies, the spread of disease through unwashed skin. Archaeology confirms lice combs, fleas in bedding, and garments stiff with grime. To modern eyes, romance in such conditions seems impossible. Yet for those who lived within them, odor was not strange. It was the background of life. Everyone smelled of sweat. Everyone lived in unwashed garments. Attraction existed despite it, or perhaps through endurance of it. To share life was to share scent, to accept the reality of bodies never free from labor. Children learned this early. Novices in monasteries, peasants in fields, even noble children in castles grew with the smell of unwashed robes. They grew to adulthood already accustomed to it. Courtship did not expect fragrance. Marriage did not promise freshness. Love was shaped in acceptance of sweat. Intimacy carried risk. Sweat carried disease, rashes, and infections. Skin rubbed raw beneath wool grew sores. Parasites spread easily in unwashed clothing. Yet lovers continued. The human need for closeness remained, even when sweat and odor marked every touch. Archaeological remains of clothing confirm it. Wool fibers unearthed from graves carry evidence of heavy wear, of sweat absorbed into cloth. Human remains show rashes, lice bites, and lesions from unwashed skin. Chronicles speak of stench in halls during summer feasts, of sweat upon sweat in crowded celebrations. These traces tell the same truth. Romance was lived in odor, not in cleanliness. For medieval lovers, the smell of sweat was inescapable. It clung to garments, to beds, to bodies. It mixed with rot of teeth, with smoke of hearths, with damp of straw. It was endured, not erased. Affection was not clean, but marked by scent. A closeness lived within filth, love and disease. Romance in the Middle Ages was never free from illness. Intimacy carried risks that were poorly understood, often deadly, and rarely preventable. Without medicine to heal infections, without hygiene to stop their spread, affection unfolded within shadows of disease. Marriage, courtship, and love all bore the weight of sickness that passed silently from body to body. One of the most common dangers was leprosy. Known across Europe, feared and misunderstood, it spread slowly yet carried stigma that lasted for life. Skin broke into sores, limbs numbed, faces marked by disfigurement. A kiss, a touch, a shared bed, all were believed to risk contagion. Some leper houses recorded cases of husbands and wives separated forever once symptoms appeared. Yet before those signs, couples often shared closeness unaware. Affection brought not only comfort but the seeds of exile. Other illnesses spread more quickly. Smallpox scarred faces, leaving lovers marked for life. Measles, influenza, and fevers moved through households, shared in breath and touch. In crowded villages, where families and animals lived together in one room, intimacy meant exposure. A cough during the night, a fever after harvest, could sweep through entire households. Romance did not protect against it. It often hastened its spread. Sexually transmitted infections existed, though they were not fully named or understood. Some records speak of the Great Pox, likely syphilis, though it rose more visibly in the late medieval period. Others mention genital sores and discharges, described without precision, seen as punishment for sin. Treatments were crude herbs, bloodletting, or prayer. Affection carried pain long after the moment of closeness ended. Husbands passed disease to wives, wives to infants, and families weakened quietly. Pregnancy itself was dangerous. Without medicine, without trained midwives in many regions, childbirth ended countless lives. For women, romance often led to risk of death in delivery, fever afterward, or loss of infants. For men, the grief of repeated loss was common. Behind the poetry of courtly love lay beds marked with blood and silence, where joy turned quickly to mourning. The plague cast its own shadow over romance. In outbreaks, intimacy became both comfort and terror. Couples clung to one another in fear, only to see one fall sick within days. The Black Death of the 14th century left records of husbands burying wives, wives burying husbands, often within hours of sharing meals or beds. Priests wrote of lovers dying side by side, their closeness sealing their fate. Romance and disease became inseparable during those years, with love stories ending in graves. Skin diseases were common and carried stigma. Scabies, ringworm, and lice left marks on skin. Couples lived with itching, sores, and scars. While poets praised soft, pale skin, real bodies were covered with blemishes, often hidden beneath wool or linen. In moments of intimacy, the truth was revealed. Rashes, scars, and boils endured without cure. Breath itself was a carrier of sickness. In crowded halls, smoke-filled lungs, damp weakened resistance, and fevers spread. A kiss passed not only affection but contagion. Yet kisses were central to courtship rituals, to marriage ceremonies, and to daily affection. To refuse was insult. To accept was risk. Nobles fared little better. Castles crowded with servants, kitchens, and animals were not cleaner than villages. Fleas, rats, and disease spread easily within stone walls. Chronicles note noble families struck by plague, kings left widowers, queens buried young. Perfumes masked odor, fine cloth covered rashes. But sickness remained beneath. Medical knowledge was poor. Illness was explained as imbalance of humors or punishment for sin. Treatments often worsened the body. Mercury was used for venereal disease, causing poisoning. Bloodletting weakened the sick further. Herbs offered some relief, but cures were rare. Love brought comfort, but comfort ended quickly under the weight of disease. Despite this, romance endured. Lovers accepted illness as part of life. They married, knowing death might come early, kissed, despite risk of contagion, bore children despite danger. Courtly love sang of devotion, not of sores or fevers, but beneath the verses lay acceptance that bodies carry disease as naturally as they carried sweat. Archaeological remains confirm it. Skeletons show signs of syphilis, with lesions in bone. Others show smallpox scars preserved in mummified remains. Mass graves reveal couples buried together, victims of plague. Chronicles describe outbreaks spreading through families, love stories ending in fever. These fragments reveal how disease shaped intimacy in every class. Romance in the Middle Ages was shadowed by sickness. Affection passed fever. Kisses carried contagion. Childbirth risked death. And plague ended countless unions. Yet life continued. Love persisted within disease, shaped not by cleanliness or safety, but by endurance. Intimacy was not free from disgust, but bound tightly to the fragility of the body. Marriage as transaction. In the Middle Ages, marriage was rarely about love. It was a transaction, a negotiation between families, a binding of property, land, and obligation. Romance existed in poems sung by troubadours, but in the daily life of villages and castles, marriage was shaped by dowries, contracts, and alliances. For children given into these unions, affection was secondary. Duty stood first. Among nobles, the purpose of marriage was inheritance. Families arranged matches to secure land, to strengthen ties with neighbors, or to build political alliances. Daughters carried dowries, chests of silver, parcels of land, herds of animals. Sons gained legitimacy, ensuring their children could inherit estates. Weddings were ceremonies not of passion, but of property transfer, witnessed by priests and lords, recorded in charters. A kiss might seal the ritual, but its meaning was symbolic, not affectionate. For peasants, the transaction was simpler, but no less binding. A man married to gain a wife's labor in the fields, in kitchens, and in childbirth. A woman married to gain security, a share of her husband's land, and a place in the village economy. Dowries here were small: a cow, a bed, or a few pieces of clothing. Yet the logic was the same. Romance was not the measure. Survival was. Consent was limited. Children were often promised in marriage before adolescence. Daughters as young as 12 were wed, their lives redirected by the will of fathers. Sons were bound by obligation to inherit and continue family lines. Love, if it appeared, came after the vows, or not at all. The union was duty, not desire. Weddings themselves reflected this. In villages, the ceremony might take place at a church door. Vows exchanged before priest and witnesses, followed by a feast of bread, ale, and meat if available. In noble courts, processions, feasts, and tournaments marked the occasion, yet beneath the celebration lay contracts signed and dowries transferred. Behind the music and the dance, the essence remained. Property had changed hands. Marital obligations were heavy. Wives were expected to bear children, often many, to ensure survival against high infant mortality. Husbands were expected to provide, though poverty often limited what could be given. Affection, when it appeared, was seen as bonus rather than foundation. The church stressed obedience. Wives to husbands, husbands to God. Love was mentioned, but duty overshadowed it. The reality of arranged unions is preserved in records. Charters list dowries with detail: 2 oxen, 1 cloak, 1 acre of land. Chronicles describe disputes when dowries were not paid, when promises were broken, when land was contested. Marriage was as much legal contract as spiritual vow. Priests served as witnesses as often as celebrants. Among nobles, affairs of the heart often existed outside marriage. Troubadour poetry praised courtly love, knights serving ladies with devotion, women admired for beauty and wit. Yet these romances were often separate from the practical bonds of matrimony. A noblewoman married for land might still be praised by another man's verse. A knight sworn to one woman's service might never be her husband. Love became literature, while marriage remained transaction. For peasants, there was less poetry. Love matches occurred, but they often required approval of lords or families. A serf could not marry without permission from his lord, for marriage meant the transfer of labor and offspring tied to land. Some records mention fines paid to secure approval. Love was not impossible, but it was costly. The church tried to elevate marriage as sacrament, yet even in its sermons, the purpose was procreation, not romance. Priests warned against lust, encouraged obedience, and reminded couples that marriage was duty before God. Sermons described wives as helpers, not partners. Romance was mentioned rarely, if at all. The weight of marriage fell hardest on women. Dowries stripped families of wealth, yet failure to marry daughters was shameful. Once wed, wives bore the risks of childbirth, their lives shortened by repeated pregnancies. Many died young, leaving husbands to remarry quickly for labor and children. Love was mourned when it existed, but often replaced swiftly for necessity. Archaeological remains echo this truth. Burials of women in their teens, sometimes with infants beside them, reflect marriages begun early and ended quickly. Documents of disputes over dowries and inheritance survive in court records. Nowhere in these remains is romance central. Duty shaped lives, leaving affection as shadow. In the Middle Ages, love existed, but rarely as foundation. Marriage was transaction. Property passed, alliances formed, duties fulfilled. Couples endured, children born, families continued. Romance belonged to songs, not to contracts. The reality was not love's triumph, but obligation's weight. The peril of childbirth. Romance in the Middle Ages often ended at childbirth. For women, love and marriage carried the constant shadow of pregnancy, and with it, the risk of death. Fertility was praised, children desired, but the act of bringing them into the world was brutal, dangerous, and often final. Behind every union lay the quiet truth that childbirth claimed countless lives. Marriage was tied to reproduction. The Church stressed procreation as the central purpose of unions. Priests preached that a wife's duty was to bear children, and a husband's duty was to provide them. Love was rarely mentioned. Fertility was the measure of a good marriage. A barren wife risked disgrace. A fertile one was praised, yet often at the cost of her health. Women married young. Noble daughters were wed at 12 or 13, sometimes earlier. Village girls followed only a few years later. Their bodies were not ready for the strain of pregnancy, yet duty required it. Records of the time mention wives giving birth before adulthood, many of them dying with their infants. For men, the loss meant remarriage. For women, it meant silence beneath the soil. Medical care was primitive. Midwives assisted, guided by tradition, herbs, and prayer. Some used oils of rue or fennel. Others burned incense to ward off evil spirits. They whispered psalms while pressing on bellies, pulling with hands, or cutting cords with knives. Yet they had no cure for hemorrhage, no remedy for infection, no safe means to turn breech births. Women labored in smoke-filled rooms, surrounded by relatives, their cries muffled by fear and prayer. Mortality was staggering. Estimates suggest 1 in 3 women died from complications of childbirth during their lifetimes. Fever followed delivery, spread by unwashed hands or dirty cloths. Hemorrhage ended lives in hours. Infants died as often as they lived, their bodies small, their breaths brief. Cemeteries revealed tiny graves beside those of young women, testimony to the constant loss. The wealthy faced the same risks. Queens and noblewomen died in childbed as often as peasants. Chronicles record them. Isabella of Aragon in 1270. Jane Seymour in 1537. Countless others whose names survive only in passing. Perfumed chambers and silk sheets offered no protection. Infection ignored rank. Blood flowed through velvet as readily as through wool. For men, the cycle was practical. Widowers remarried quickly, securing new wives to continue family lines. For women, there was no choice. They endured pregnancy again and again until their bodies failed. A wife might bear 10 or 12 children, only to see half survive. Her own life ended in the process. Romance was not protection, but the path into suffering. Childbirth shaped intimacy. Fear lingered in every union. Wives knew that closeness with husbands often meant another pregnancy, another risk. Husbands knew loss as routine, burying wives with infants, remarrying and beginning again. Love, if it grew, was shadowed by the knowledge that it might be cut short at the next labor. Superstitions surrounded the process. Amulets were worn, relics placed beneath beds, saints invoked in prayers. Women drank mixtures of herbs believed to ease pain or ensure survival. Some carried charms carved with words of scripture. Others tied knots in belts as symbols of protection. Yet survival depended less on ritual than on chance. Those who lived often called it miracle. Archaeological remains confirm the burden. Skeletons of young women show signs of repeated pregnancies, pelvic bones widened, spines bent from strain. Infants buried beside mothers tell stories without words. Parish records list deaths during childbed with regularity, their numbers forming grim patterns across decades. Poetry ignored this truth. Troubadour songs praised women for beauty, devotion, and fertility, but rarely for suffering. Courtly love celebrated longing and desire, yet the real outcome of marriage was risk, pain, and loss. Romance in verse hid the reality of blood-soaked beds, grieving families, and infants carried quietly to graves. The church offered comfort through ritual. Priests blessed women after childbirth, granting purification, yet these blessings often followed funerals. Families prayed for mothers who never returned from labor, and marriages ended with bells tolling for both wife and child. For women, romance in the Middle Ages meant surrender. They surrendered their bodies to duty, to fertility, to danger. They endured pregnancies again and again, without medicine, without safety, without control. Their lives were shortened. Their stories ended in silence. Men wrote the poems, priests wrote the sermons, chroniclers wrote the records. Women wrote little, their voices lost in the cries of childbirth. Behind the illusion of medieval romance lies this reality, that for countless women, love was inseparable from risk, affection tied to death. Every embrace carried possibility of loss, every marriage the likelihood of blood. Romance ended not in happiness, but often in a grave shared with a child who never lived to grow. Hidden affairs and quiet betrayals. Marriage in the Middle Ages was built on duty, but desire often moved elsewhere. Behind the solemn vows spoken at church doors, behind the contracts of dowries and inheritance, there were affairs hidden, whispered, and sometimes known but tolerated. Infidelity shaped romance in ways that poetry disguised and chronicles hinted at, turning loyalty into performance and love into secrecy. Among nobles, marriages secured property and alliances, not affection. A lord might marry a woman chosen by his family, but his attention often turned toward mistresses. Castles were filled with servants, courtiers, and visiting ladies, any of whom could become companions beyond marriage. Some noble women, too, sought comfort outside their unions, their husbands absent in war or cold in affection. Affairs were dangerous, but not rare. Courtly love itself often praised desire outside marriage. Troubadour poetry from the 12th century celebrated knights who pledged themselves to ladies already Wednesday. They sang of longing glances, secret meetings, and devotion that defied vows. Though the songs spoke of purity, the reality often included intimacy, concealed in chambers or gardens. What was praised as noble service was also quiet betrayal. For peasants, infidelity was less poetic but still present. A farmer's wife might find companionship in another man while her husband worked distant fields. A husband might turn to another woman during his wife's pregnancy or illness. Villages were small, yet life continued with unspoken knowledge. Sometimes the community accepted it. Sometimes it led to disputes recorded in manorial courts. The church condemned adultery harshly. Priests preached of eternal damnation, of sin against God, of betrayal of vows. Punishments varied: fasting, penance, public shame. In some cases, women were forced to walk barefoot through villages, men fined or whipped. Yet despite threats, affairs continued. The human need for closeness outlived sermons. For women, affairs carried greater risk. If discovered, they could lose dowries, be cast out, or face public disgrace. Men, especially nobles, often faced lighter judgment. Chronicles record kings and lords keeping mistresses openly, their wives powerless to object. Queens, however, who strayed, risked death. The double standard was sharp, shaping who could betray in silence and who suffered for it. Children born of affairs complicated inheritance. Noble families feared bastards claiming land. Charters carefully listed legitimate heirs, while others were excluded. Some illegitimate children, however, were acknowledged, given roles in churches or armies. For peasants, the matter was simpler, but no less painful. A child resembling another man became quiet proof of betrayal, its presence accepted or denied, depending on circumstance. Records of infidelity appear in legal disputes. Manorial courts in England note women accused of adultery, fined for their acts. Ecclesiastical courts across Europe heard cases of men abandoning wives for mistresses. The details survive in dull language, yet behind them are stories of longing, secrecy, and punishment. Affairs were lived in shadows, yet they left marks in documents that endure. Even monasteries were not free from whispers. Chronicles tell of monks accused of liaisons with village women, of nuns punished for breaking vows of chastity. Love, hidden and forbidden, crept even into cloisters where silence was law. Desire crossed every wall, unbound by vows, unbroken by sermons. The danger of affairs was not only spiritual or social. Disease spread through secrecy. Without knowledge of medicine, infections moved silently. Husbands passed illnesses from mistresses to wives. Wives caught sickness from lovers and spread it to husbands. The shame of exposure was compounded by the physical toll, visible in sores, fevers, and early death. Archaeological traces reveal this quietly. DNA studies of medieval remains show cases of children buried with mothers, but genetically unrelated to supposed fathers. Chronicles mention noble disputes over heirs, questioning legitimacy. Songs of courtly love survive, filled with longing for women not married to the singers. Together, these fragments reveal infidelity not as rare, but as woven into medieval romance. For those who lived it, secrecy was survival. Lovers met at night, in barns, in chambers, in gardens, behind walls. Words were whispered quickly, glances exchanged carefully. Romance was not open declaration, but hidden gesture, coded verse, or brief embrace. Every moment carried risk of discovery, yet the risk was accepted. Poetry transformed betrayal into beauty. Songs praised longing that could never be fulfilled, painting infidelity as noble devotion rather than sin. Yet behind the verses, bodies met in straw beds, in castle halls, in shadowed corners of villages. The truth was neither noble nor beautiful, but lived in filth, secrecy, and fear. Romance in the Middle Ages was rarely faithful. Marriage was transaction. Love was often outside it, and affairs shaped lives in silence. For men and women alike, betrayal was part of survival, part of longing, and part of the human need for closeness that rules and sermons could not erase. Brothels and transactional love. Romance in the Middle Ages was shaped not only by marriage or secret affairs, but also by commerce. In towns and cities across Europe, brothels stood as ordinary institutions, licensed by authorities, tolerated by the church, and visited by men from every class. For many, love and desire were purchased, not freely given. Behind the illusion of courtly devotion, there was a steady trade in bodies. Prostitution was widespread. In village records, women accused of selling their services appear frequently, fined by manorial courts yet continuing their work. In larger towns, such as London, Paris, or Florence, brothels operated openly, often under municipal license. Authorities believed that by permitting prostitution in controlled spaces, they could limit greater sins such as adultery or rape. The brothel became, in their eyes, a necessary evil. Inside these houses, the reality was grim. Rooms were bare, filled with straw bedding alive with fleas. Curtains of wool offered little privacy. Women wore dresses of red or yellow, colors used to mark their trade. Clients were peasants, merchants, soldiers, even clerics. Transactions were quick, the exchange of coins for minutes of intimacy. Romance was absent. Duty, survival, and desire filled its place. Many prostitutes were driven by poverty. Widows without dowries, abandoned wives, and unmarried mothers had few options. Some were sold into the trade by parents or husbands, others coerced by pimps and innkeepers. For them, prostitution was not choice, but necessity. The work offered food, shelter, and coins, but at the cost of health and dignity. Disease spread rapidly in brothels. Sexually transmitted infections, though poorly understood, were recognized by their sores and fevers. Chroniclers write of the burning sickness, or the secret malady. Some women grew disfigured, their bodies marked by illness. Yet they continued, for survival demanded it. Clients carried disease back to wives, mistresses, and villages, spreading suffering silently. The church condemned prostitution, yet tolerated it. Priests denounced brothels as dens of sin, but bishops often collected fines from them. In some cities, church officials directly regulated sex workers, requiring them to live in designated districts. This contradiction reveals the complexity of medieval thought. Prostitution was both condemned and accepted, both sin and necessity. For men, brothels became part of youth and travel. Students in universities visited them as rites of passage. Soldiers frequented them between campaigns. Merchants sought them while on journeys. Love, in these contexts, was transactional. Poems and songs mentioned taverns where ale and women were sold together, where affection was bought by the hour. For women, the toll was harsh. Few grew old in the trade. Many died young from disease, violence, or childbirth. Records from city hospitals mention fallen women admitted for fevers and sores, often dying soon after. Children born to prostitutes were often abandoned at church doors or raised in poverty, their fathers unnamed. The cycle repeated, generation after generation. Archaeological remains confirm these realities. Excavations in medieval towns uncovered districts filled with tavern remains, pottery shards, and bones marked by poor diet. Some cemeteries contain women buried apart, their bodies showing signs of disease and malnutrition. Documents describe fines collected from brothel keepers, lists of women licensed to work, and complaints from neighbors about noise and disorder. Romantic ideals ignored this world. Troubadour poetry praised noble ladies, not prostitutes. Chronicles recorded marriages and alliances, not transactions in taverns. Yet beneath the silence, the brothel shaped the lives of thousands. It was here that many men experienced intimacy first. Here that disease spread most widely. Here that countless women endured suffering in silence. Even monasteries were not untouched. Some records mention monks caught visiting brothels, punished by abbots but forgiven after penance. Priests themselves were accused of keeping mistresses who lived much like prostitutes, supported in exchange for silence. The contradiction between vow and practice was clear, yet never resolved. For the community, brothels were tolerated but despised. Women who worked there were excluded from processions, denied burial in consecrated ground, and mocked in sermons. Yet men who visited often faced no punishment. The burden fell on women, their lives reduced to service, their names erased. Romance in the Middle Ages was not only love poems sung in courts. It was also this, the exchange of coins in darkened rooms, the endurance of women driven by hunger, the spread of disease through intimacy bought and sold. The disgusting truth lies not in isolated sins, but in the acceptance of prostitution as part of ordinary life. Behind the images of knights and ladies, of devotion and purity, stood streets lined with brothels, women marked by red dresses, and men who sought them nightly. Romance was commerce, intimacy was survival, and the line between love and transaction was often erased. The Church and the rules of love. Romance in the Middle Ages was shaped not only by custom and survival, but also by the Church. Priests, bishops, and councils set rules for marriage, intimacy, and desire, declaring what was holy and what was sin. Every union, every act of affection, was judged against doctrine. Love was not private. It was supervised, regulated, and defined by authority that claimed to speak for God. Marriage became a sacrament in the 12th century. Before this, it had been seen largely as a contract between families. Once the Church declared it sacred, priests gained control over who could marry, how vows were spoken, and which unions were permitted. A marriage without the blessing of a priest could be declared invalid. Love was brought under ecclesiastical law. The rules were strict. Couples were forbidden to wed within 7 degrees of kinship, a measure so broad it included distant cousins. Many unions were annulled when connections were discovered, or when families used these rules to break unwanted matches. Desire between kin was declared incest, punishable by excommunication. Yet in small villages, where families intermarried for generations, these laws were often impossible to avoid. The Church restricted when intimacy could occur. Certain days, Lent, Advent, feast days, Sundays were forbidden. Altogether, nearly half the calendar was off limits. To break these rules was sin. Manuals for confessors listed every restriction, every act to be confessed. A husband who touched his wife at the wrong time was told to fast, to pray, to repent. Romance was reduced to schedules of holiness. Acts themselves were judged. The only acceptable form was intercourse within marriage, for the purpose of procreation. To seek pleasure was considered sinful. Manuals warned against positions, against excess, against affection beyond duty. Even within marriage, desire was shadowed by guilt. Lovers risked confession for the very closeness they shared. The Church also punished those outside marriage. Fornication, adultery, and prostitution were condemned. Punishments varied: fines, penance, fasting, public humiliation. In some places, women accused of adultery were forced to walk barefoot through streets. Men confessed their sins, but often continued. The double standard lingered across centuries, leaving women with greater burdens. Clerics themselves struggled. Though priests were required to remain celibate, many kept mistresses or fathered children. Councils condemned them repeatedly, yet the practice continued. Parishioners often knew, but silence prevailed. The contradiction between rule and reality was clear. The church preached purity while its own priests failed to embody it. Confession brought intimacy under surveillance. Husbands and wives whispered their sins to priests, describing acts and thoughts. Manuals guided confessors in questioning, asking about times, positions, and intentions. The privacy of love was broken by ritual, its details judged and forgiven through penance. Couples lived with the knowledge that even their bedroom was not beyond the reach of the church. Court records preserved disputes over marriage. Couples sought annulments, claiming kinship or lack of consent. Some appealed to bishops when unions broke down, others when dowries were withheld. The church became the arbiter of love, its judgments shaping lives. For many, this meant years of litigation. Their marriages treated as legal cases rather than unions of affection. Archaeological remains echo this regulation. Marriage rings inscribed with crosses, manuscripts of canon law, and confession manuals survive. They show how deeply the church penetrated the daily lives of couples, binding them not only through vows, but through endless rules. Poetry stood apart. Troubadours praised desire, often beyond marriage, celebrating glances, kisses, and longing. These songs ignored the church's rules, or hinted at rebellion. Yet even these verses could not erase the weight of law. The church remained stronger than song, shaping what was spoken at altars, what was whispered in confessionals, what was lived in silence. For peasants, the rules were felt in restrictions of marriage. Lords required permission for serfs to wed, but priests enforced the church's laws. Couples who lived together without vows were condemned, their children labeled illegitimate. For nobles, the rules shaped politics. Alliances annulled, unions forbidden, heirs declared bastards. No class escaped the weight of ecclesiastical power. The church's presence in romance was total. It defined who could love, when they could touch, how they could live. It bound affection to schedules, reduced intimacy to duty, and shadowed desire with sin. Love became less private expression than public obedience. The disgusting truth of medieval romance lies not only in filth and disease, but also in rules that turned affection into confession, and intimacy into law. Love potions and superstitions. In the Middle Ages, love was not only shaped by duty and law, it was also surrounded by superstition, charms, and quiet practices of folk magic. When affection failed, when desire was unreturned, or when marriages were arranged without passion, people turned to remedies they believed could bend hearts and bodies. Romance was guided as much by herbs and spells as by vows and sermons. Love potions were common in folklore. Recipes appear in manuscripts, blending herbs, animal parts, and whispered prayers. Some instructed the mixing of wine with crushed plants, such as henbane or mandrake, believed to inspire desire. Others advised powders made from dried insects or bones, stirred into drinks without the knowledge of the one targeted. These concoctions were dangerous, often poisonous, yet their use persisted. In a world where choice in marriage was limited, magic seemed one of the few ways to shape love. Amulets were worn to attract affection. Small carvings of hearts, rings inscribed with words of devotion, or relics tied to saints were believed to draw desire. Women placed charms beneath pillows. Men tied knots in belts as symbols of binding. Some carried stones said to hold power, such as amber or jet. Archaeological finds reveal rings and pendants inscribed with Latin phrases of love, traces of faith, and objects to guide affection. Superstition extended to marriage rituals. Couples believed that knots tied during ceremonies symbolized binding of hearts. Breaking such knots was feared as breaking of vows. Some brides carried herbs in their gowns, rosemary for loyalty, thyme for fertility, rue for protection. Grooms sometimes placed coins in shoes for luck, a practice said to secure prosperity and devotion. These customs blended Christian blessing with older pagan traditions, tolerated quietly by priests, though not always approved. Spells for attraction appear in court records. Women were accused of using herbs to lure men, Men accused of charms to win women already Wednesday. Trials of witchcraft often included charges of love magic. Confessions, sometimes extracted under pressure, describe powders sprinkled on clothing, prayers whispered at night, or wax figures pierced with pins. Whether true or forced, they reveal a belief that romance could be bent through hidden means. The church condemned these practices. Priests warned that love potions were the work of the devil, that charms were superstition, that true affection could not be forced. Manuals for confessors list questions about magic, instructing priests to rebuke those who used it. Yet despite warnings, the practices survived. Desire ignored sermons, and desperation outweighed fear of sin. Not all love magic aimed at attraction. Some sought to prevent desire. Wives used herbs to quiet husbands. Powders slipped into ale to reduce lust. Husbands sought charms to prevent wives from straying. These were forms of control, shaped by fear of betrayal. The same superstition that sought passion also sought its restraint. Archaeological remains suggest the persistence of these practices. Bottles with residues of herbs, inscribed rings, and amulets appear in medieval graves. Some carry inscriptions not of scripture but of strange symbols, half Christian, half pagan. These fragments suggest that love, however defined, was never free from attempts to manipulate it through unseen powers. Poetry and song sometimes referenced these beliefs. Troubadours hinted at love as enchantment, at eyes that bewitched, at kisses that bound. Behind metaphor lay the reality of a culture where magic was blamed for passion. If a man fell in love suddenly, he might say he was bewitched. If a woman turned cold, suspicion fell on charms that bound her elsewhere. Superstitions extended to fertility. Women carried amulets during pregnancy, wore belts inscribed with holy names, or drank mixtures of herbs believed to ease childbirth. Some of these rituals blurred with love charms, for fertility was tied to affection. A barren wife risked abandonment, and so she turned to potions, prayers, and relics to ensure her place in marriage. In villages, superstition was often practical. Charms were simple tying threads, wearing herbs, whispering names. In castles, it was more elaborate potions prepared with costly ingredients. Astrologers consulted to determine auspicious days for unions. Yet whether rich or poor, all sought means beyond themselves to shape romance. The danger was real. Some herbs were toxic. Mandrake caused hallucinations, henbane seizures, cantharides deadly poisoning. Those who drank potions often grew sick, sometimes fatally. Chronicles mention sudden deaths blamed on love charms, though the truth was likely poison. Yet belief endured. Desperation for affection, for loyalty, for fertility outweighed fear of harm. For most, love in the Middle Ages was not free choice. It was shaped by family, duty, and law. Superstition offered a way to bend that reality, however briefly. Potions, charms, and spells gave the illusion of control. They did not erase filth, disease, or duty, but they reflected the need to hope for more. The disgusting truth of romance in the Middle Ages lies not only in dirt and disease, but in desperation. Behind every charm was longing. Behind every potion was fear. Love was fragile, controlled by law, burdened by duty, shadowed by death. Superstition filled the spaces left empty by choice, turning affection into ritual and romance into fear of what unseen forces might bring. Jealousy and violence. Romance in the Middle Ages was fragile, shaped not by freedom, but by control. Jealousy often turned love into suspicion, and suspicion into violence. Within marriages arranged for duty, within affairs hidden in shadows, within communities where secrecy was rare, jealousy grew easily. The absence of trust, combined with the harshness of law and the weight of honor, made violence part of intimacy. Husbands were granted authority over wives by both custom and law. The church taught that women should obey, that men held headship of households. If wives strayed, suspicion alone could bring punishment. Chronicles describe husbands striking wives, accusing them of adultery, sometimes without proof. Courts often supported them, granting men the right to discipline. Violence was seen as correction, not crime. Wives accused of infidelity faced humiliation. Some were paraded through villages barefoot, others forced to confess in churches, others beaten in public. Jealousy was not private, it became spectacle. The weight of honor demanded it. A man shamed by rumors of betrayal risked losing standing in his community. To punish his wife, was to reclaim reputation, even when no betrayal had occurred. For women, jealousy carried fewer outlets. If they suspected husbands of straying, their complaints rarely found justice. Men were permitted mistresses more openly, while wives who questioned faced rebuke. Violence against husbands was rare and punished harshly. Records show women fined, imprisoned, or executed for striking men. Jealousy among women expressed itself more often in whispers, in gossip, in appeals to priests, rather than in force. Affairs brought further danger. Lovers discovered risked beatings, imprisonment, or death. In some regions, men caught with married women were mutilated, their bodies marked permanently. Women discovered in affairs could be drowned or burned. Though these punishments varied widely, communities often enforced them, seeing jealousy not only as personal but as collective defense of order. The language of jealousy appears in poetry. Troubadours sang of knights jealous of rivals, of ladies scorned by faithless lovers. Yet these verses soften the reality. Behind the words of longing and betrayal lay bruises, broken bones, and graves filled by violence. Romance in literature was passion. In life, it was risk of harm. Archaeological evidence reflects this quietly. Skeletons of women buried in medieval cemeteries sometimes show broken ribs, fractured skulls, or healed injuries consistent with repeated blows. Records of coroners' inquests mention wives found dead after disputes, their deaths attributed to punishment. These fragments reveal the presence of violence within unions that poetry praised as sacred. Jealousy was not confined to marriage. In villages, fights broke out among young men over women, disputes that ended with wounds or deaths. Courts recorded stabbings during festivals, assaults in taverns, brawls in fields. Love triangles were not romantic, they were bloody. Communities tolerated them, so long as the violence did not grow too great. Honor drove much of this. A man betrayed by his wife was dishonored. A woman abandoned by her husband was disgraced. Honor demanded response, often through force. Violence was seen as restoration, not excess. Communities upheld it, for their order rested on reputation as much as law. The church condemned violence but reinforced authority. Sermons urged husbands not to beat wives excessively but permitted discipline. Priests counseled patience but reminded women of obedience. Jealousy was described as sin when it led to murder, but tolerated when expressed through correction. The contradiction left couples trapped within cycles of suspicion and harm. Children witnessed this. They grew in households where jealousy flared into blows, where mothers were struck, where fathers enforced silence. They learned early that romance carried not joy but fear, that unions promised not safety but conflict. These lessons carried into their own marriages, repeating the cycle. For nobles, jealousy carried political weight. Kings accused queens of infidelity, sometimes executing them. Chronicles record queens imprisoned, noblewomen cast aside, heirs declared illegitimate. Jealousy at court could shift alliances, topple dynasties, or bring wars. What began as suspicion within marriage became conflict across kingdoms. Among peasants, the scale was smaller, but no less brutal. A man jealous of his neighbor might strike in a tavern. A woman jealous of a rival might accuse her of witchcraft. Violence spread from private suspicion into public accusation, shaping communities through fear and rumor. Romance in the Middle Ages was shadowed by jealousy, and jealousy was sharpened by the tools of violence. In homes, it meant bruises and silence. In villages, it meant fights and feuds. In courts, it meant executions and annulments. The disgusting truth is not only the filth of daily life, but the pain inflicted when affection twisted into suspicion. Jealousy left marks not only on bodies but on memory. Chronicles recorded disputes, courts listed punishments, skeletons carried fractures. Love was fragile, rarely free, and often destroyed by violence justified as honor. For men and women alike, romance was lived within fear that devotion could at any moment turn into accusation, and accusation into pain. The lie of courtly love. When people today imagine medieval romance, they often think of courtly love. A knight kneeling before a lady, singing songs of devotion, pledging loyalty that transcended war and hardship. Troubadour poems from southern France, romances written in castles, and paintings on parchment all portray love as noble, refined, and pure. Yet this was largely illusion. Behind the words and images, daily life was filled with filth, duty, and suffering. Courtly love was less truth than fantasy, a performance written for audiences far removed from reality. The songs of troubadours began in the 12th century. They praised ladies of noble courts, often women already married. Knights pledged themselves to serve these women, to carry their colors into battle, to suffer in silence for their affection. The language of these poems speaks of sweetness, loyalty, and sacrifice. But the women they praised were not free to choose. They were bound by arranged marriages, confined by duty, often guarded within castles. The songs celebrated longing that could rarely be fulfilled, turning frustration into art. For nobles, courtly love became entertainment. Poems were recited in great halls, stories written of knights risking all for ladies. These tales spread through manuscripts and performances, shaping ideals of romance for centuries. Yet they ignored the realities of noble marriages, which were arranged for land and alliances, not affection. Behind the veil of poetry, unions were still transactions. The language of purity hid the presence of affairs. Many knights and ladies engaged in secret relationships, some physical, some only whispered. Poetry made these liaisons appear noble, disguising infidelity as devotion. What was betrayal in law became loyalty in song. The contradiction reveals that courtly love was not a reflection of reality, but a reshaping of it into something more pleasing. Among peasants, these ideals were distant. They heard fragments of songs, perhaps performed by wandering minstrels, but their lives were not transformed. Their marriages remained bound by dowries and survival. Their love stories were written in fields, kitchens, and village courts, not in illuminated manuscripts. For them, romance was not noble service, but labor, childbirth, and the daily presence of hunger. Courtly literature exaggerated beauty. Ladies were described with skin as pale as snow, hair golden like wheat, lips red as roses. Yet real women lived with scars, skin darkened by sun, teeth worn down by grit and bread. Illness and childbirth marked their bodies. Men, too, were described as flawless, brave, strong, loyal, yet real knights, often bore lice, scars, and broken teeth. Poetry was dream, not truth. The church complicated these ideals. While troubadours praised longing, priests condemned lust. While poems described kisses as noble, priests listed them as sins in confession manuals. The reality of romance remained under surveillance, judged by law and sermon, no matter how it was celebrated in verse. The tension between art and life reveals how far apart they stood. Archaeology shows this gap as well. Manuscripts filled with delicate images survive, portraying noble lovers in gardens, exchanging tokens. Yet in the same centuries, skeletons revealed disease, malnutrition, and death at young ages. Teeth decayed, bones bore marks of heavy labor, women died with infants in childbirth. The contrast between painted pages and buried remains reveals how deeply courtly love concealed the truth. Courtly ideals also silenced women. Though poems praised them as objects of devotion, they rarely gave them voice. Ladies were described, admired, and longed for, but their own thoughts are absent. The men who wrote and sang decided what women symbolized, while the women themselves lived constrained lives, their duties far removed from the freedom imagined in song. Even within noble courts, women faced suspicion. A lady admired by many risked jealousy from husbands or rivals. If her reputation grew too bold, she could be accused of infidelity, her status threatened. What poetry celebrated as longing, society condemned as sin. Women lived between admiration and accusation, their lives far less romantic than the verses suggested. Courtly love became cultural mask. It covered the filth of daily life, the smell of sweat and rot, the presence of lice and fleas, the burden of duty and death. It offered nobles an image of themselves as refined, noble, and elevated above peasants. But it was illusion. Beneath the mask, marriages remained bargains, intimacy remained risky, and romance remained fragile. The disgusting truth of medieval romance is this: that courtly love was a story told to make life bearable, not a reflection of life as it was lived. Real love was hidden in sickness, in filth, in duty, in silence. Poetry promised beauty, but the reality was hunger, disease, and betrayal. Festivals of lust and disorder. Romance in the Middle Ages did not unfold only in castles or within arranged marriages. It often appeared during festivals days, when work paused, when ale flowed, and when order loosened. In these moments, desire was expressed through drunkenness, disorder, and opportunity. Behind the solemn sermons of priests and the idealized verses of poets, there were nights of chaos where intimacy was sought in crude and public ways. Festivals marked the calendar. May Day, midsummer, and harvest celebrations were times when villages gathered in fields or churchyards. Fires were lit, dances formed, and drink was shared freely. These gatherings created spaces where young men and women mingled beyond the supervision of families. What was often described as merrymaking frequently slipped into excess, where romance meant not courtship but lust, encouraged by drink and darkness. May Day carried particular associations with fertility. Villagers danced around poles decorated with flowers and greenery. Songs praised the renewal of nature, but chronicles hint at behavior less innocent. Couples wandered into fields or woods, returning hours later with grass on clothing and dirt on skin. Priests condemned these practices, declaring them sinful, yet they continued year after year. Carnival, held before Lent, was marked by even greater disorder. Masks were worn, roles inverted, rules mocked, men dressed as women, servants mocked masters, and license was given for indulgence before the fasting season. Intimacy followed quickly. Behind masks, identities blurred, and encounters occurred that were later denied. The church tolerated carnival but preached fiercely against its excesses, recording complaints of fornication and adultery arising from its chaos. Alley houses played a role in these gatherings. Drink was cheap, strong, and widely consumed. Villagers drank heavily during festivals, and drunkenness blurred lines of propriety. Women risked harassment, men boasted of conquests, and fights erupted as jealousy flared. Records of manorial courts include fines for brawls, accusations of assault, and disputes over paternity, trace back to festival nights. Songs sung during these gatherings often carried crude verses. Lyrics joked about lust, mocked marriages, or hinted at secret affairs. These songs, passed orally, contrasted sharply with the refined poetry of troubadours. They revealed that romance at the village level was not idealized but rough, filled with humor, lust, and little subtlety. For women, these festivals were double-edged. They offered rare moments of freedom, away from the strict eyes of family or priests. Yet they also carried danger. Drunken men pressed for affection, sometimes without consent. Court records mention assaults during May Day or harvest gatherings, women testifying to unwanted advances. The same festivals that gave opportunity also created risk. Archaeological finds hint at these customs. Figurines of couples, charms buried in fields, and broken drinking vessels appear in layers corresponding to feast days. Written records describe priests preaching against lewd dances and sinful wandering in woods. Together, they show that romance during festivals was often far from refined. The church tried to redirect these impulses. Priests organized processions, inserted prayers into gatherings, and banned dances considered indecent. Yet their efforts rarely erased the behavior. Human desire, intensified by drink and celebration, overpowered rules. Sermons delivered after festivals often repeat the same complaints year after year, evidence of their failure. Nobles held their own festivals, banquets, tournaments, and hunts. These, too, offered opportunity for intimacy beyond marriage. Guests stayed for days, drank heavily, and mingled freely. Chronicles mention affairs sparked during tournaments, noble women accused of wandering gardens at night, nights boasting of secret encounters. Behind the glitter of feasts, romance was shaped by indulgence, much like in villages. The danger of disease followed. With multiple encounters during festivals, illnesses spread quickly. Doctors of the time noted surges of fevers and sores after large gatherings. Though they lacked understanding of infection, they observed the pattern. The connection between intimacy and sickness was known, even if poorly explained. Festivals also produced illegitimate children. Parish records mention births that could not be traced to marriages, oftentimes 9 months after feast days. Mothers bore the burden, sometimes forced to confess in churches, sometimes raising children in poverty. Men often escaped responsibility, hidden by drink or masks. Communities tolerated these outcomes, yet gossiped endlessly about them. The illusion of romance in festivals is preserved in later art, where peasants are shown dancing joyfully in fields. But the truth was less innocent. Drunkenness, disorder, and lust were at the heart of many gatherings. For those who lived them, romance was not poetry or devotion, but chaotic moments in fields and taverns, forgotten as quickly as they occurred. The disgusting truth about medieval romance is not only in disease or dirt, but also in the crude reality of celebrations. Festivals were not escapes into joy, but into excess, where love was reduced to drink, masks, and lust that left behind scars, feuds, and forgotten children. The Middle Ages are remembered through stories of knights, castles, and songs of love, yet the reality was darker, heavier, and marked by filth, duty, and disease. Romance was lived in sweat-soaked garments, in straw beds filled with fleas, in marriages bound by contracts rather than choice. Behind troubadour poetry and painted manuscripts lay childbirth that ended lives, affairs hidden in shadows, and festivals that dissolved into disorder. The truth of medieval intimacy is preserved not in beauty, but in bones, in charters, and in records of courts that punished desire. It is a reminder that love was fragile, often transactional, and rarely the ideal sung in verse. As you rest now, let the quiet rhythm of history settle over you. If you wish to drift again into forgotten worlds told softly and without haste, remain with us, subscribe, and join us once more.